welcome back, students. We are inserting a fun module here to further talk about risks. Last module, we talked about enterprise risk management, and the difference between that module and this one is going to be after management themselves identifies their risks and they come up with a program called most likely enterprise risk management to document their risks. We as internal audit can use those risks to really decide what we're going to look at in the year. And so that's kind of my overall explanation. And kind of another little side note here, if you look at the business school offerings here at MSU Denver, there is actually a course on risk management. And what I want you to know about that is that's more similar to what we talked about last week from enterprise risk management, where first line or second line really kind of holds the ERM program. But this is where you could learn as a business person how to manage your own risks. That's the risk management course. This section within this module is, okay, now that the organization and the business owners and managers, they know what their risks are, we as internal audit can kind of use that, do our own risk assessment and decide what we want to do our work on. So that is my kind of long-winded introduction to this module. And luckily we have Jennifer from Arizona, Peoria, the city of Peoria, back with us to talk about how they do it. And if you remember, she in the internal controls module started talking about this, how she has met with a lot of the different departments. I think you said 16, Jennifer, is that right? And I know things get shifted around all the time, but she sat down with them and really cataloged their risks. And that could be a part of, the risk management for them. And then she's going to do her own processes and assessment, which she probably did along with them, to determine her audit work for the year. So Jennifer, explain in your own words what I just said and how you do it there.
Yes, so we started with a citywide risk assessment, which kind of, as you described, was talking to all the different, directors for the different departments, there's some of their managers. I think I did 50 to 60 interviews, sitting down and, an hour or so at a time. And it was very detailed and walk me through what you do and why you do it. And we talked about risk and identified some controls. And then I take that information back for each of those interviews and kind of document within this methodology that I developed a way to score them, to attempt to, compare apples to apples, because when you're talking about risks that exist in the police department compared to risks that exist in water services, they're very different, but you have to find some way to compare apples to apples so that you're choosing the highest risk areas, because that's really where we want to spend our energy as internal auditors, addressing the things that can really get our organization in trouble or can cause more significant problems.
Yeah, so, and like you said, you're a department of one, so you really have to prioritize. And I think just a good side note to mention to all the students out there, if you are ever interested in a job in internal audit, there's so many opportunities, because you can be a department of one at lots of places, like the city and like every city out there, right? So lots of opportunities in government, or you could work at a company like Wells Fargo that has I think 1,700 internal auditors, right? So there's a variety of opportunities out there. So that's just a side note. Okay, so a couple things that you talked about that I want to dive deeper into. I like to use this term audit universe. So I just want to kind of mention that again, and specifically to me, that means how you organize your organization, right? You break it into this universe. And so you obviously, the city have kind of breaking it up by department, like you said, fire department, police department, water, all of that. So I just wanted to kind of bring that define that specifically. And then you mentioned interviews to meet with all those people. Now, if you're at an organization that has way too many departments that you cannot possibly meet with any of them, what are some other ways that you think you can get information? I know I personally love doing surveys. And Jennifer, you've probably heard my soapbox on surveys before, but have you done anything else to kind of gather information?
Being at different size organizations, I've done a variety of things. One thing I did want to to touch on about the audit universe is I think the best way to start that process is to start with an organizational chart. That's always my number one, even if it's a business of thousands and thousands of employees, like how does the business see themselves organized? And then you can start breaking it down from there. But then yes, other than interviews, surveys, self-assessments where you are kind of asking management to assess things on, from their perspective. You can develop, and that can be done via a survey. You can also do it, send it in an email, and they can kind of answer questions related to sort of the same thing as a survey. But you can also do independent research on their website or through pulling data out of the financial system if you're talking about the size of their operations, because that's another component. I think our risk assessment has 13 or so categories that are assessed and scored for each of those operational areas. And so you have a whole bunch of information. One of those is financial. So we, dig into our financial system and break it down and how big is the department from an expenditure standpoint, how much revenue do they bring in, that sort of thing. But then you also have it balanced with what types of programs do they offer, and are there legal risks and things that need to be considered in determining their risk score, which is what it boils down to, at least on our end, is we end up with a score. So all of those, 16 departments, and with a total of like 55 areas, I think they all have a score at the end of the day, and we end up sorting highest score to lowest, and we really want to focus our attention and energy on those higher scored, higher risk areas.
That was a perfect explanation. Thank you. Of just the overall process. And I'm going to kind of dig into each one of those areas a little bit more. So we've built our audit universe. I love your tip about using the org chart. That's perfect. And continuing to look at that every year as it changes during this process is a great tip too, because things change. And then the 13 categories, I think this goes back to kind of a risk conversation from the earlier module. One of those categories could be what's their financial risk, like you said, how many dollars flow through that, operations, what kind of programs, things like, reputational risk. It might be a lot bigger for the police department than it is for another department, right? So, and this allows you to look at and score each one of those areas differently. So I'm guessing your 13 categories are like that. I don't know if there's any other ones you want to mention, or
well, we actually have a category for any other sort of sets of eyes, or that second line of defense, and projects that have taken place recently. That's another area where you can kind of look as you're assessing what other information is already out there, what assessments have already been done. So I would take that into account if I've already been in that department and have assessed that area or done a project in there, or maybe they have another independent auditor that comes in for some regulatory or statutory requirement. Well, a lot of times you can get your hands on those reports because they're public documents or easily available if it's within a company. So taking that into account, has somebody else already looked at this? That's another category that we have captured in our risk assessment.
I love that, because it gets to this concept of inherent risk versus residual risk, which is, not something you fully need to understand for this course, but I do think at a high level, just knowing that you can risk assess in kind of two different ways. And I love that your risk assessment kind of is what I would consider a comprehensive risk assessment that would include able to say, we know we've audited this area for the last, 4 years every year, and they've had a clean, audit that, we could bring them down from a risk rating a little bit. And I like that you can bring in that knowledge to it.
And you mentioned that comprehensive risk assessment, we do that's how we choose which projects or which departments we're going to go into. But then when we get into an individual engagement, we do another risk assessment within that particular area. So, and in that, we take those, what you refer to as inherent risks, the things we identified in that comprehensive risk assessment as our starting point. And then we ask a lot more detailed questions about what controls are in place to mitigate that. So then we have that inherent risk. Here are the controls in place, the control environment. And then after that, what's left over? And that's that residual risk. Like, what do we still have that's not addressed?
Yeah, I love that. So we'll talk about planning and engagement, and that would kind of go into that module a little bit later, but perfect example or perfect description of how it all ties together, right? This is kind of high level to lower level of where we use this information. So you mentioned that we get a score at the end of the day. What are the factors that you're scoring? Do you use like impact or likelihood? I know I've seen various ones used. I think those are the two most common, but what do you all use?
Yeah, impact and likelihood. Some organizations will take, score those two separately and they'll multiply them. Sometimes they'll add them together,
Yeah.
But it all boils down to, how likely is this issue going to be an issue? And then if it does happen, how bad is it going to be?
Yes.
And I think that, again, keeping it simple, that's basically what it boils down to. And then you end up with a score at the end. So
yeah. And I've seen companies, organizations do it so complicated.
You don't really need to make it that
right. Yeah, I guess it's just like anything. You can make it as complicated as you want to, but you could even do like a score, 1 being very low risk, 10 being very, very high risk, and give everything a score in between, right? So don't overcomplicate the process in your head. It can be fairly simple to get.
Yes, it can. Like I mentioned the 13 categories. They're all up to 10 points, and I have documented descriptions on what falls in which scoring within that scale. So, but at the end of the day, it's really score of 1 to 10. Like, how bad is it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then at the end of the day, I know obviously we use this to build our audit plan for the year, like you explained. Do you go back to management and tell them your assessment? Maybe that happens when you're actually auditing that area or working in that area, and then talk about how you report our results for the risk assessment to your board or your audit committee. What does that look like for you?
So the answer to your first question is yes, I always go back. I don't think all auditors go back.
I don't think they do either.
But I think it's a really, really good idea. Because for a couple of reasons. One is you're not in the operations day to day, right? You're coming from an objective perspective. You're providing a different, set of eyes in an area that you're not involved with day to day. So sometimes you don't see everything, right? So it is so helpful to go back at the end and kind of affirm that the sense that you're getting about their operations is accurate, right? Or did you miss something? Maybe to you, there's a giant hole in this very important process, and you didn't capture because maybe you didn't, ask the right question or whatever, which is totally possible because you're human.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't capture an important control that's in place. Well, when you go back and say, well, I think this is high risk because, and you explain that gives management the opportunity to go, well, I can understand why you would say that, but we have this in place. And you're like, oh, I didn't know, right? I think it happens all the time, and it's kind of a normal part of the process. Second is it's really good for relationship building with your auditees, right? They feel like they have some input in the process and that you're there to listen to them. Because if you just do your assessment and you go out the door and you're not involving them in that, by the time you get to the report writing process, if anything isn't, if they don't agree with anything, well, you haven't given yourself the opportunity to correct that, and then they tend to get mad on the back end, right? So from a relationship standpoint, it's also important.
Yes, I completely agree with that. Communication is key. Over communicating sometimes is not a bad thing with our clients, right? The only, I'd say, caveat to that I've seen where it's kind of backfired talking to management about how we risk rated them is when they think their business is like the riskiest business out there, but they're not comparing themselves to the other departments within the organization, right?
Yep.
And so sometimes you do have to be that, person that is able to make that independent assessment, given that we get to see all of the organization, right? They work in their silos. So that's the only time I've seen it. Maybe I had to intervene.
Yeah, and I had that too especially at that comprehensive risk assessment level.
Yeah.
Where one particular department that, again, not that what they do is not important, but when you compare that to something like the police department and the fire department, the types of risks that you're talking about are just, they're not comparable. Life and death versus records retention type of, it's very different. And so you have to help them understand that yes, what you do is very important, but it doesn't compare in this way. And there's additional legal or financial risk to the organization because of this other operation. So
yeah,
they don't always like it, but yeah, you definitely can't subvert your auditor judgment just because they think that they're the highest risk.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, okay. So my second part of that question, since I asked such a long question, was what about to the board? Are they interested in, and obviously they want to know what we're looking at every year, but they probably want to know why we're looking at what we're looking at every year. So do you report like high level of the risk assessment to them?
Yep. So there's a report that for us goes up to our city manager's office and or audit committee, depending on what type of organization you're at. And ideally that should describe the methodology that you use to come up with this, these risk ratings and why you're choosing what you're choosing. It's tricky because you put in a ton of very detailed work by the time you've gotten to that point, and most of the time you've got, a few minutes of their attention to really get your point across.
Yep.
So I'm not sure if you're doing another module on reporting or whatever, but I'll leave that to there. But yes, I mean, we summarize a great deal at where the scores are. I don't typically tend to include the risk scores themselves in an external facing report. Partly for the reason that you mentioned, you don't want other departments to go, well, I'm high risk and how dare you put me in, below this or whatever. So in mine, I chose to omit the actual scores themselves, and I just bucketed the departments in alphabetical order so that they couldn't even within the high, medium, and low buckets, because I felt like that still gave our executive leadership team a good idea of where things fell without opening myself up to a whole slew of questions as to why one was one line below or one line above.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The scrutiny, right? We don't need any more scrutiny. And to answer your question, yes, we're going to talk about obviously the three modules to doing an engagement. Will be planning, performing, and then communicating. And we won't get into a ton of communicating at the audit committee level, but a lot of similarities to, the report that we write. Maybe we rate things in there. Sometimes that gets subjective and controversial as well. And I know visuals, we will talk about visuals a lot in the reporting process. And I've seen a lot of good visuals used when we report the risk assessment results. So, here are, all the high risks, right? And I like your alphabetized, but I have seen them done by literally high to low. But using, tables and we use great tools like Tableau now to do pie charts and graphics. And I think that's really good for, to provide info to the audit committee as well.
And I also had a couple of different, I had the detailed list with the scores in one graphic. And I took that with me so that if they asked questions, I could, I had the information at my fingertips to say, this is kind of how it breaks down.
Yeah.
But for local governments, our, work papers are protected by statute here in Arizona, but our final report is not. So I also have to be considerate of the fact that somebody in the public could pick that up. And I wouldn't want them to necessarily have all that information, but I do have it available. So when I got questions, I could definitely answer those.
Always prepared.
Yeah,
I like it. Always prepared. Perfect. Well, I personally don't think there's much more on risk assessment to share at this point with the students. I know that One of the questions I was going to ask you was what do we do with it? But I think we've pretty much answered that. We build our audit plan, and then we start planning our audits individually by doing their own risk assessments, and we'll capture that within planning and engagement a little bit later down the road. I do want to ask you one last question that I've been asking everybody that I have done these interviews with is, do you have any advice for students? Just one tip, anything that you could share, maybe you would have told your younger self that, personally, professionally, that would be a piece of wisdom for them to leave them with?
I know this sounds pretty cliche, but I kind of live by it, is trust your gut. That's really important as an auditor, right? Like if you get the feeling that something doesn't feel right, or you feel like you need to dig a little deeper, then you go ahead and do that until you feel comfortable. There's definitely a balance there, but yeah, I mean, I feel like that's happened to me a handful of times in my career, and there was a reason for that feeling.
Yeah, I love that. Instincts are there for a reason, and sometimes we don't listen to them enough, I think. So great advice, and not cliche at all. I love it. So thank you so much for being with us in all the wisdom you brought to the 3 modules that we've talked to you about. So thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.